Welcome to part 2 of the many inconsistencies of Megaman X6. For this video, we'll be continuing on with the discussion of the gameplay started in the previous video. We'll be tackling the main feature of X6, the nightmare phenomenon, and the other systems intertwined with it. Before talking about the nightmare phenomenon, I would like to start first with the game's controls. I apologize if it seemed like I was leading you on, but I personally think it's distasteful that I don't go over it since it's part of the gameplay. Luckily, X6 controls similarly to most Mega Man X games on the PS1. However, there are a few minute differences here and there that we'll be discussing. Regardless of which character you use, the controls are as follows: X to jump, square to use the main weapon, triangle to use the secondary weapon, and circle to dash. You use the D-pad to move around, L1 and R1 to cycle through your special weapons, and R2 for the Giga Attack. The Mega Man X PS1 games are one of the many good examples of designing controls for games. Characters control similarly, yet play differently. Despite having the same controls, the way a character plays and feels differ from each other. X is for shooting enemies from afar, while Zero is for close quarters combat. It's a creative way of getting around what could be considered simple controls. Let's talk about what X6 does differently. For starters, as I mentioned previously, X can now use the Z saber as Zero was supposed to be dead or missing. The saber is assigned to the triangle button. Thankfully, this doesn't hamper the button's other purpose, which was for using the special weapons he gets by defeating the bosses. For Zero, he returns with his Z-Buster, which is really broken and overpowered. In X5, who you choose as the intro stage character defines whether or not Zero has his Buster. The Buster is mapped to the triangle button. Another thing worth mentioning is that unlike the previous games where it takes the D-pad and a button to use Zero's moves, X6 decides to split them between two buttons. In X4, you use the triangle button. For X5, you use the square button. For X6, it's either the triangle or square button. Personally, I didn't like this approach, but to give credit to where it's due, it does surprisingly work well. However, I do question some button combinations needed for certain attacks. Are there anything else about the controls? Arguably, this game has smooth controls thanks to the arguably fluid animations. There are a lot of animations in the game that you can cancel out of, letting you do some really cool things like the returning /dash cancel or this saber wall climb you can do with X. Admittedly, I have no concrete way of proving this, so this could be considered a mere speculation on my part. The main takeaway of this section is how the developers didn't reinvent the wheel for the controls. If it isn't broken, don't fix it. They instead refined them to the point that they become second intuition. Let's finally talk about the nightmare phenomenon. As I mentioned in the previous video, plot-wise, they didn't expound on the nightmare system and left everything to the gameplay. So it could be the 21XX Scourge of God for all we care. From what I've seen around, there's a general consensus ranging from anger to disappointment for the nightmare system. This system felt like it was supposed to be similar to X1's level-changing system, wherein defeating a boss affects the behavior and appearance of another level. It was a really neat idea that they were able to implement really well in X1. But the main problem with the nightmare system is that it is shoddy at best and excruciatingly irritating at worst. For starters, there is no information in-game that tells you how the system works. You're just expected to figure it out. Now, this isn't a bad thing. Games should be able to convey itself to the player, eliminating the need of forcing a tutorial down your throat. With how complicated and badly implemented the nightmare system is, well, the approach of conveyance just isn't feasible. Now, contrary to popular belief, I would like to clarify that the nightmare system isn't fully random. It feels like that thanks to its implementation and how it fails to follow its own rules. In the stage selection screen, there are these Mavericks whose icons are in red. What people understood and expected at the time was that choosing those icons will let you experience the nightmare effect of that level. Sadly, that wasn't the case. This caused mass confusion and rightfully pissed off a lot of players. It felt like an arbitrary system. How it really functions is as follows. Visiting one stage will have an effect on one or more different stages. The effects last until a new one is applied. Stage effects cannot overlap but replace one another. This means that if you played Magma area, the stages that should be affected by the Nightmare system will have their effects activated. If you want to play the affected stage normally, then you have to play a different level instead, like Inami Temple, which affects different stages entirely. Doing this also eliminates the effects from the previously afflicted stages. The reason I know this is not because of observation or testing. It's because I had enough of being annoyed and looked up a guide instead. When a system for a game requires people to look up a guide to successfully understand it, the system is presenting itself wrong. And I think this was the main problem with the Nightmare phenomenon. Players felt helpless at the randomness of it that it didn't make itself any favors. I'm not saying that you should have a long tutorial or explanation on how the system works, and I'm not saying you should have Aelia tell a story on the Nightmare. I'm saying that you should make it obvious on how it works. It doesn't even have to be oversimplified. You can do it in patterns as well. Keyword is conveyance. Now an argument could be made of how players should read the manual first before playing a game, and granted you are right. However, my counter-argument is, what if the game is technically old and no new copies of the game are being made? What if they only circulate through secondhand shops? And of course, buying secondhand doesn't necessarily mean in good or complete condition. I think a better solution would be to have the manual in-game as well. Going back to the Nightmare effects, this means that in theory, there are multiple ways to experience a level. The levels have 2 Nightmare effects that can be applied to them, meaning there are 3 ways to experience a stage. To give credit where it's due, X6 doesn't make the level changes permanent like X1. You won't be playing the new updated version of the level for the rest of the game. I would also like to point out that the level design doesn't change at all when experiencing the Nightmare effect. Instead, they open up certain optional paths that would have likely been blocked before or hard to get through without the Nightmare system. Does this mean that there's replayability to the levels? In theory. That's because none of the Nightmare effects are fun to experience, and they make playing through a level a darn chore. Some Nightmare effects aren't as bad as others, but they will find a way to annoy you. Originally, I was planning on discussing each Nightmare effect in detail, but I noticed stuff being a repetitious time waster. Instead, feel free to pause and look at this chart I made quickly detailing how to activate a specific Nightmare effect and which levels they affect. With that said, let's move on to the 8 Nightmare effects and how they behave. First is the Nightmare Cube. They are multicolored blocks that tend to be in the player's way. These blocks can only be affected by the special weapons you get by defeating Brown Scaravage. Using them on the brown and red ones will destroy the blocks, while the blue and black ones will only move them. The red one will explode, dealing damage to the player if near it. The blue one will slide when hit, and the black one will only move a short distance. The cube by itself isn't really that dangerous. I believe what irritates players the most about them is that they are always placed in parts of the level where progression can be easily hindered. It also doesn't help that the cubes are usually stacked on each other and can be experienced on one of the worst levels in the game. Next is the Nightmare Dart. It makes a good majority of the screen pitch black, only leaving a small part around you visible. I think this is the most hated Nightmare effect for multiple valid reasons. First off, there are already problems in terms of level design for the afflicted stages. Second is that the visible and pitch black areas aren't static but are moving in a set pattern. There are times where there's more darkness than visible areas, making it harder to see. Last is the visible area itself. It could have been a certain area, like a circle around the character, but instead they decided to be fancy and make it move. Then we have the Nightmare Fire. This makes it rain fireballs at a certain parts of a stage. The fireballs can be destroyed using the special weapon you unlock by defeating Blaze Heatniks. The main issue with this effect is that the fireballs tend to spawn from random directions in multiple amounts, making them nearly impossible to dodge or even deal with. What happens is that you keep on getting hit a lot. Last time I checked, I was playing Megaman X6, not a bullet hell like Toho. Fourth is the Nightmare Ice. It coats some surface in ice, making them slippery. The ice can be destroyed by using the weapon you get from Blizzard Wolfang. Honestly, it isn't worth trying to destroy them. It's arguably faster to just deal with it and move along. I don't think this effect angered a lot of players that much. Next is the Nightmare Iron. They are iron blocks that rise up and down, behaving similarly to the Crusher of the Recycle Lab. They can be destroyed by using the weapon you get from Metal Shark Player. Unlike the Crusher of the Recycle Lab, these blocks won't kill you instantly. They do deal a significant amount of damage though. They aren't really atrocious except when they're completely blocking your path. Then we have the Nightmare Mirror. These are silhouettes of either X and Zero that immediately rushes through the player. They are very reminiscent of X4's Soul Body weapon and X5's Zero Virus behavior. The mirrors can be destroyed by Shield Sheldon's weapon through contact. This effect isn't really that bad, but they are annoying because they are placed in parts of the level wherein you have to take your time because of level design or scenarios that force you to halt your progress. This results in some very cheap hits. The Nightmare Rain is next. It is rain accompanied by strong winds that pushes the player in the direction it is blowing. This isn't really lethal and is probably the best and most tolerable nightmare effect. The last one is the Nightmare Bug. They are these small bugs that fly near the player. These are annoying since they just come out of nowhere and can collide with the player dealing damage. They can also come in numerous numbers, and when there are too many, they tend to be in the way of attacks. Attacking them constantly will make them fly away, but they will return after a certain amount of time. They can be successfully destroyed using the weapon you get from Commander Yamark. Looking back at all 8 effects, it says a lot when only one of them is considered okay, while the rest are on a range of annoying to outright rage-inducing. The worst part is that you really don't get anything special when you play the levels with the nightmare effects on. You also can convince people that being able to get the collectibles be the reward for enduring the nightmare effects is because some of these have been part of the fundamental gameplay loop of the X games for a while. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to implement a similar system in games. As mentioned earlier, X1 does something similar and it worked out. Let's not forget that there were many things that made the nightmare system a big pain in the neck. It honestly felt like this wasn't playtested properly and was just quickly put in the game. My main point is that if you are going to try something similar, then make it so that A. It's playable, B. It actually adds substance to the level, and C. That it isn't infuriating. X6 isn't the first to try this, and obviously X1 isn't as well. It's just really sad that this flopped, considering there are so many examples they could have taken away. Let's talk about the Nightmare Souls and the rank system. Admittedly, the Nightmare Soul is a part of the Nightmare system, but it's better to explain it in conjunction with the rank system since they go hand in hand. Thanks to the Nightmare phenomenon, levels will have this enemy called the Nightmare Virus, a DNA-looking Cyclops. These things are important as they serve multiple functions that affect multiple features in the game. For starters, they are the most common enemy that you will find outside of the Megaman X staples. When you destroy them, they will drop this blue orb called the Nightmare Souls. The Nightmare Souls serve as points that works with the rank system. A blue orb is worth 8 points, however, if you leave it be, it will shrink and by that time, it will only be worth 4 points. If you don't pick it up, the Nightmare Virus will respawn. Killing a respawn virus will not yield any more orbs. Before I discuss the Hunter rank system, I think it's worth pointing out that there is a green orb. You get this by defeating one of the 8 Mavericks or by farming them out of Dynamo, who is an optional boss for this game. A green orb is worth 200 points, and you can get 3 green orbs from fighting Dynamo, yielding a total of 600 orbs per Dynamo fight. Now, the question is, how does the Nightmare Soul affect the rank system? Basically, the more Nightmare Souls you have, the higher your rank is. This is a far simpler and more welcome implementation of the rank system compared to when it was introduced in X5. In X5, it meant nothing, but in X6, it actually affected the gameplay. The rank system will affect the amount of special parts that X and Zero can equip, and trust me, you will want to equip the special parts. There are 8 Hunter ranks in total, with each detailing how many parts you can equip to a character. The Hunter ranks are on a per character basis, so the ranks are not shared between X and Zero, and getting to a higher rank on both characters will require grinding. As I mentioned earlier, I like their implementation of the rank system. It has some depth to it instead of just being a label. I find it a bit immersive as well since it gives this slight sense of progression. It isn't perfect though, and I do have some problems with it. Granted, it isn't entirely at fault since the Nightmare Souls are the main culprit. The problem with the Nightmare Souls is that if you have already gone through a level, you won't be able to collect the souls of the viruses you've already destroyed. To make the souls respawn, you have to activate one of the nightmare effects of that stage. Great, more torture. Another problem is the points they provide. 8 points is not enough, and more so when the soul shrinks. Normally you can only get 200 points from beating the bosses. If you didn't go into the alternate paths, which is plausible, that means you've never fought Dynamo. If you've never fought Dynamo, then that means you've never farmed souls from him. I'll admit that putting Dynamo here for grinding is kinda okay, but it's not the best decision since A. What is he doing here? Where did he come from? B. It seems like the developers didn't know where to put him. C. Why does he have Nightmare Souls and what does he plan to do with it? And D. If you do decide to head into the alternate paths, he is the third optional boss, which means you had to fight Brick Wall here first. It's marred by questions to successfully crash on top of it. Are there any problems with the ranking system itself? I do have one gripe with it, which can be considered a nitpick. If you go back to the list of ranks, you'll see that the final rank, UH, requires you to grind to 9,999 souls for a character. 9,999 souls is the maximum that you can have. Rank UH lets you equip 5 special parts, and having 5 slots to do so is pretty darn important and useful. However, it is a grind to get to 9,899 souls, and the alternate paths aren't fun to play themselves. I understand the diminishing returns logic behind it, but come on! It shouldn't really be that high. I don't think it would be unreasonable to not require the player to reach 9,899 souls. It would have been cool instead to give the player an incentive for even grinding to that amount. I understand the argument that the game doesn't force you to grind to 9,899 souls, and you're right. But believe me, having 5 slots to place special parts in is really freaking important and useful. I'll explain it when we discuss the special parts, but I digress. Anyways, last time I checked, good game design doesn't make it seem a requirement to grind to a certain amount of points just to have an easier time playing the game. The rank system, though a great idea, should be something optional that the player could decide on whether or not to spend time on. Good game design would have made it so that the player shouldn't feel obligated or dependent on mechanics as such. Let's talk about the collectibles of Megaman X6 like heart tanks or special parts. Regardless of whatever comment I make about the collectibles, I would like to make it clear that X6 does item collection right and better than X5. Item collection is more straightforward and easier to accomplish, though some are hidden in a very stupid fashion. A good majority are in plain sight and you don't need very specific requirements to be able to collect the items. First are the armor parts, which I talked about in the previous video. Let's make this brief. X6 follows the same armor collection behavior of X5. You need to collect all 4 armor parts to unlock them. I think it's debatable whether this is a good thing or not, though I do understand the logic behind those not in favor since this wasn't the case for the previous and later entries. Anyways, a good majority of them are easy to get, while others need a lot of specific movements which can really be annoying. Next are the energy tanks, weapon tank, and EX tank. Nothing really changed, you still have 2 energy tanks and 1 weapon tank for a total of 3 refillable tanks. You still have to fill them up every time you use them. The weapon tank is still as useless as in the previous game. The EX tank also functions the same, still letting you start with 4 lives instead of 2. Standard stuff. Third collectible are the heart tanks. Like the previous games, there are a total of 1 in each level for a total of 8. They extend your life by 2 units, which might not sound like a lot at first, but once they stack, you can see them pay out. The heart tanks are still not shared between characters. X has a different max health compared to Zero. However, X6 does the heart tank collection and placement better compared to X5. In X5, a lot of heart tanks were only obtainable by X thanks to the required use of the Gaia armor. In X6, the heart tanks are in plain sight, making it easy to give both characters the same amount of heart tanks. The final collectible are the special parts that I have mentioned since part 1. I can't explain this part properly without talking about the rescuable Reploids as they are tied to each other. The rescuable Reploids are a returning mechanic from X5. Like the rank system, X6 has a better implementation for the rescuable Reploids. In X5, there are only specific levels to give a sense of urgency. They heal the player for certain amounts of points and provide extra lives. In X6, not only do they do those, but some carry special parts which can help X and Zero. There are 16 rescuable Reploids in all of the 8 stages for a total of 128 Reploids. These Reploids are scattered in both the main and alternate pathways, so you have to explore every nook and cranny of a stage. If you think that there are 128 parts to collect, you are mistaken and can safely calm down. Per stage, only 5 out of the 16 Reploids carry a special part. There are a total of 40 special parts and they are categorized into 4 types. Normal parts, which can be equipped by both X and Zero. They have the most variety on their functions and would be the ones most commonly used. Next are the X parts, which are only usable by X and affect how his attacks behave. There are also Zero parts, which does the same thing. Lastly, we have the limited parts, which are a one-time use per stage item. These parts have some really powerful uses, especially if you know how to use them. As I said earlier in the rank system, assuming you grant it to rank UH, you have a total of 5 slots for special parts, 1 for the limited parts, and the remaining 4 for the remaining types. Compared to X5, the rescuable Reploids are not found in all 8 stages. Also, there are glorified OneUp and health pickups. I'm glad that in X6, they have more function and weight to them. Saving them actually has a benefit outside of being healed and role-playing the good guy. As for the part system, it was really convoluted in X5. For starters, you can't get all the parts and you don't get them by saving a Reploid. Instead, you get them by meeting some requirements while beating one of the 8 Mavericks, and this behavior wasn't presented nor communicated really well. In addition, not everyone has the same amount of parts that can be equipped. In X6, regardless of which character or X armor you choose, you will always have the 5 slots. In X5, that's not the case. The amount of special parts you can put varies between the characters and the X armors. That's not to say that the part system is perfect. Like the rank system, the part system is also held back by the nightmare system. Let's go back to the nightmare virus. As mentioned earlier, this is the most common enemy scattered nearly everywhere. Most of the time, you'll find this enemy near a rescuable Reploid, and for a horrible reason. The virus has the capability of corrupting a rescuable Reploid, turning them into an enemy. And since they're an enemy, you have no choice but to kill them. No way to shake off the virus while it's corrupting a Reploid, and no way of purifying a corrupted Reploid. Why don't you just restart the stage? Well, it won't work. Rescuable Reploids don't respawn when you leave the stage, unlike X5. It's a one-time thing. If you lose a Reploid thanks to the virus, you're better off restarting the game from a save point. If you haven't connected the dots yet, this means that if a Reploid that got corrupted has a special part, you won't be getting it anymore. To be fair, not all nightmare viruses act like this. Some are programmed to focus on attacking the player, while some are focused on getting to the nearest Reploid. For some reason, their programming won't activate if their sprite is within the bounds of the camera. Also, a nightmare virus movement speed is really slow, but it doesn't mean jack since a lot of them are placed so close to the Reploids. Just a heads up for the people playing this game, the developers luckily have the foresight to not put a nightmare virus near the Reploid that has the jumper part, which is required to finish the game as X. Moving away from the nightmare system, I do have criticisms with the special parts. First off is that despite having 40 special parts, only 6 of them feel really worthwhile and useful. We have the aforementioned jumper that is necessary if you want to finish the game as X, speedster that makes you move faster, hyper dash that makes your dashes faster, shock buffer that increases your defense, D-barrier which increases the length of your invisibility periods, and life recover which is another energy tank. Not choosing any of the 6 will more often than not translate to a very annoying if not downright irritating X6 playthrough. It's as if not choosing any of the 6 increases the difficulty of the game. It's also counterintuitive to the whole purpose of the part system, which is to give the player the freedom and capability to improve something in how the character plays. There's no experimentation if the game's design forces you to choose from the 6. It's false freedom. Admittedly, nothing is stopping you from not choosing any of the 6, except for jumper if you are playing as X. You will need that. Another complaint I have is who thought that requiring a special part to finish the game as X was a good idea? Seriously! In the games prior to X5, there were no special parts. You can finish the game as armored or unarmored X. Why suddenly shift away from this design? And even then in X5, jumper or any part were not needed to finish the game. The special parts are supposed to improve whatever it was supposed to improve. In X5, jumper made you jump higher, improving the rate at which you can go through vertical sections. In X6, yeah, it did that, but the fact that I can't finish some levels as X because I can't jump higher is freaking ludicrous. Even if you tell me to just play as Zero, which is a totally valid thing to suggest, it's still not a long-term solution. We are instead moving around the problem, and doing so further emphasizes that there is indeed a problem with the game design. I admit that the jumper part isn't at fault and that it's the level design, but that doesn't change the fact that you need a special part to finish the game. As you can see, most of the stuff I talked about in this video are severely tied to, if not fully influenced by, the nightmare phenomenon. And I do this with good reason. Remember, the nightmare system is the main gimmick of X6, and because of how flawed of a game mechanic it is, it sadly held back the other features and mechanics connected to it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't tie game mechanics to each other. If anything, I like to praise the creativity that the developers did in finding a way to connect all these things together. But since it flopped in the end, everything else was affected. The point I'm trying to raise here is that if your main feature is connected and branching out to different game mechanics, well, you better make sure they all work well and not drag each other down. You have to make it work. It's one thing that an individual mechanic is bad by itself. That can be easily ignored. But it's severely different if the main mechanic tied to the individual ones is flawed from the beginning. It has to work well as it is the main selling point, a pillar of your game. In the next video, we'll finally be talking about the level design and the alternate paths. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.